Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the February 24th Metro Board activities. I'm Matt Letourneau, Chairman of the Finance and Capital Committee. Before we begin, I'll turn the floor over to Teresa Impastato, our Chief Safety Officer, for today's safety contact.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we near the end of February, American Heart Month, it's an important time to focus attention on heart disease, the #1 killer of Americans. While diet and exercise are important to maintaining a healthy heart, one of the best things you can do for your heart is to stop smoking or vaping, and consider enrolling in a smoking cessation program. Additionally, during the COVID-19 pandemic, many people have delayed or avoided going to their doctors for checkups or even to hospitals for heart attack and stroke symptoms, ultimately netting poorer outcomes. As we prepare to move into the spring, take charge of your health and schedule a checkup with your doctor. This concludes February's Safety Contact.
Thank you, Teresa. Since this is our first meeting of the day, I'll ask the Board Corporate Secretary to call the roll.
Thank you. Chair Letourneau.
Present.
Vice Chair Babers.
Present.
Mr. Zappi.
Present.
Ms. Klein.
Present.
Mr. Smedberg.
Present.
Dr. Lowe.
Present.
Mr. Drummer.
Present.
Ms. Martin Proctor.
Present.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Our first order of business is to approve the agenda. There are no objections. We'll consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections by members of the committee? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Now to the approval of the minutes. We have the minutes of the February 10th meeting before us for approval. Are there any objections to the minutes as presented? Hearing none, we'll consider the minutes approved as presented. We only have one item on our agenda this morning. It will help us as we continue our work on the FY23 budget. The discussion will focus on the process that Metro uses to evaluate proposed permanent major changes to service, fares, and access to fair media in the context of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As a recipient of federal funds, Metro must comply with the Federal Transit Administration's Title VI requirements, which require transit agencies to conduct an equity analysis of proposed changes. I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Tom Webster to lead us through the discussion and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Again, my name is Tom Webster, Executive Vice President for Strategy, Planning, and Program Management. This morning we will provide a summary of the process used to conduct service and fare equity analyses required under Title VI, and that's in advance of the committee and the board's consideration of the FY23 budget next month. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to all recipients of federal funding. Metro's Title VI program includes several elements: public participation, language access, legal notices, Title VI complaints, and of course, service and fare equity analyses, which is our area of focus this morning. All of these elements are designed to help ensure that transit operators are not denying access to the benefits of public transportation on the basis of race, color, or national origin. The Federal Transit Administration also requires that transit operators consider income in equity analyses. FTA guides transit agencies to proactively avoid or to address disparate impacts, which apply to minority riders, and disproportionate burdens, which apply to low-income riders. The current FTA Title VI circular was issued about 10 years ago, and it establishes the process for transit agencies that receive federal funding, including Metro, the processes that we are to follow when assessing equity. As part of that process, FTA requires transit agencies to adopt definitions for major service changes, and then specific thresholds for determining what constitutes a disparate impact to minority riders or a disproportionate burden to low-income riders. The board adopted these definitions for Metro back in 2013. FTA also requires that agencies prepare and submit a Title VI program program update each of every 3 years to demonstrate the agency's compliance with those Title VI requirements. The board last approved Metro's current Title VI program about a year and a half ago in September 2020. And then last June, the board authorized a number of service and fare changes on a temporary basis, many of which were implemented back in September. And many of those changes are part of the service and fare proposals the board will consider for adoption next month as part of the FY23 operating budget. Next is a summary of Metro's demographics by the bus and the rail modes. Based on survey and ridership data, approximately 84% of Metro bus riders are minority, while 50% have a household income of $30,000 or less. And then on Metro Rail, approximately 47% of riders are minority, and 16% have a household income of $30,000 or less. These estimates are important because they serve as the base against which service changes and are compared to when conducting equity analyses. So FTA's Title VI circular requires that Metro prepare service and fare equity analyses for all permanent major service changes, fare changes, and changes in access to fare media, so the way of purchasing fares. The purpose of the analysis determines whether plan changes will have a disparate impact on the basis of race, color, or national origin, or a disproportionate burden on low-income riders. These analyses come in two basic forms or methods, one for service and one for fares. For a service equity analysis, the analysis compares the demographics of those who are affected by the service change to the service mode average, so by bus or by rail. So for example, a bus proposal that benefits a group of riders that is 82% minority, that 82% is compared to the mode average of 84% for a difference of 2%. That difference is then applied to what are the board adopted disparate impact and disproportionate burden thresholds. They're shown on the right hand of this slide. For service additions, the focus is on not going under by that percentage. And then for service reductions, the focus is on not exceeding that percentage. For fares, the process is similar because the analysis compares percentages. However, for fares, the comparison is the change in fare as a percentage for minority riders compared to non-minority riders, and the change in fare as a percentage for low-income riders to non-low-income riders. So in other words, the analysis compares one group against the other, not against the mode average as it is with service. In addition to that, the FTA requires that public outreach be conducted and that public feedback be considered prior to, so in advance of making major service or fare changes permanent. Not all service and fare changes are subject to service or fare equity analyses. FTA rules guide an agency that they can operate service and fare changes on a temporary basis. For service changes, this period's defined as 12 months or a year, and for fares, it's for 6 months. This next slide shows the process used to conduct a service equity analysis. The first step establishes a baseline to make that comparison against. And each year, staff aligns survey data to that fiscal year's estimated ridership. Staff analyzes bus ridership for each line for each service day, so weekend, Saturday, and Sunday, and then analyzes rail ridership for each station, each time period, each service day, and then in some cases, each origin and destination in the rail system, and all that to create a mode average. We then evaluate each service proposal and determine which riders in which time periods are affected by the service change, and then align that ridership data to the survey data to determine how many riders are minority and how many riders are low income. This process is then completed for every major service change until the total number of all riders, minority and low income riders are calculated. Then staff compares the shared or the share of protected populations to the overall share for that mode. If the difference exceeds the threshold, then there's a potential disparate impact or disproportionate burden. So when faced with a potential disparate impact, there are basically two paths forward for the board. The first is to prevent a disparate impact by balancing out the proposed potential change up front, so in advance. This is the preferred approach and leads to the preferred outcome. The second path is to propose the change, conduct the analysis, and then confirm that there is a disparate impact. And then, as shown on the column on the right, this would necessitate the need to create a business case. In FTA terminology, it's called the substantial legitimate justification. So then a transit agency would also need to show that it considered alternatives that result in less of a disparate impact, or then mitigate that impact by providing additional bus or rail service. So this process will be applied to the service fare and access to fare media changes that are part of the FY23 budget. So this slide lists the items that were part of the public hearing and the public participation process that was authorized by the board in December and took place over the past couple of months. This can be an iterative process, so if there are changes to the docket or changes to the proposal, the analysis, the Title VI analysis results can change. So importantly, Title VI or transit equity is much broader than Title VI. Title VI, as I just described, is focused on avoiding disparate treatment and avoiding additional harm. However, it's not designed to address broader racial or social equity or inequities. It tends to be, as I just walked through, very process focused and transactional, looking at a specific set of changes or proposed or potential changes and analyzing them against a baseline or against another group. Equity requires a much broader, more systematic look at the distribution of transit infrastructure and services, the quality of those services, et cetera. So with that broader picture in mind, the board is taking a more proactive approach to transit equity that extends beyond that compliance requirement with Title VI. The board adopted a framework for transit equity in July 2020, which renewed Metro's commitment to advancing regional mobility and equity, and outlines specific areas that for focus on policy that includes service and fare equity. Some of the key actions to date: the board adopted revised Metro bus service guidelines and Metro rail service standards. Last year approved all-day rail and bus service improvements and free rail to bus transfers. Established an independent police investigations review panel, adopted sustainability vision and principles, has renewed the focus on public and customer engagement, and achieved the goal of awarding over 25% of contract values to disadvantaged business enterprises. So for next steps, as we discussed, the public engagement is really a key part of Title VI, and staff is wrapping up the report on that process this year, and we'll share the results as part of the FY23 budget next month, along with the final recommendations for fare and service changes. As part of that process, we'll also finalize the equity analyses, and that concludes our presentation, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. If you have questions, use the raise hand feature and we can entertain those. In the meantime, Tom, I'll ask you one, which is, can you walk us through where the demographic data actually comes from, how that is obtained?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. At a high level, it is obtained by surveys of rail and bus customers.
When was the last group of surveys done?
The last surveys, let me make sure I get this right. The last rail passenger survey was in 2016, and the last bus passenger survey was in 2018.
Yeah, so I have expressed concern about that in the past, and renew the concern that the data is rather out of date. And we've had some discussion about how it relates to Silver Line in particular, which I'm not going to rehash. But do you know, are there any plans to update that data? It looks like Lynn has an answer on that.
Mr. Chairman and Tom, if I may, the rail passenger survey will be conducted this year. It will be completed in the fall. Obviously, during the initial phases of the pandemic, we wanted to wait until we saw ridership stabilize and start to emerge from the pandemic to get the truest possible picture of ridership. We've decided to proceed this year. And then the bus passenger survey will follow rail.
Okay, thank you. Are there other questions from members of the committee? I see one hand popped in. I got to figure out who it is. I think it's Sarah. Ms. Klein.
Sorry, my computer is doing strange things. There we go. Just a quick question. The public outreach for Title VI is the same as the process of going through the compact public hearings for the budget. Is that right? It's not a separate outreach, or is it?
So in this case, it was combined with the overall budget process and the compact public hearing. So in for the FY23 budget, it was one combined process. For Title VI purposes, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. The important part is public feedback. So in the event that a compact public hearing isn't happening at the same time, you can proceed with another form of a public input process.
Great. Okay, but in this case, it's wrapped together, so we'll get the results when we get the overall hearing results. And then just quickly, I'm interested. I know the board prior to many of the members being on it established those thresholds for disparate impact and disproportionate burden. Do we have a sense of how Metro compares to other transit agencies nationally of comparable scope and size in terms of where those thresholds are set? How much guidance came from the Federal Transit Administration in terms of establishing where those thresholds would be?
I do know it's been, as I mentioned, more than a year and a half since we went through this. I do know we did look at comparison to other transit agencies as part of that process. I don't recall offhand exactly where we are in comparison to some of our peers, but that is definitely part of what we look at as we move forward with the recommendations to the board.
Great. Okay. Well, perhaps I can go back or someone can help me go back and find that information. Thank you.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. I think Ms. Babers was next.
Actually, Chair, Sarah asked my question, so I'm good.
Okay. Chairman Smedberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tom, Lynn mentioned just procedurally, how does this work? Lynn is going to do this survey later this fall, but as I understand it, we need this information sooner than that, don't we, for some of this process? I mean, that's all well and good that we're going to do a new survey, but it's certainly not going to be done or ready in time for you to have to finish this process in the timeline that I think I saw in the presentation or in the background documents.
No, for this process, we will be relying on the survey data that we have.
Oh, you will. Okay.
Yes. The recommendation on the budget to the board is next month, so we have to rely on that information.
On the current information.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. So Lynn's new information won't. I mean, again, it's all well and good. It's happening. Yeah. Okay.
And the current information, if I may, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Smedberg, just add that the current information does ask demographic questions, and so it will provide breakouts for the board to consider by low income, minority, and other participants in the survey. So you will be able to see how opinions may vary and what priorities the riders placed on the various proposals.
Okay. And Tom and or Lynn, what's your interaction with the jurisdictions in gathering some of this information? Or is there?
In terms of the periodic rail and bus survey information, when we conduct that, we do coordinate with the jurisdictions on those. In terms of the input into the budget process itself, of course, there's close coordination with jurisdictional staff. So when we proceed with these surveys, the bigger surveys that feed the Title VI process, coordination with the jurisdictions on how we're doing that and proceeding happens, and then in addition that budget coordination annually.
Okay, great. And I asked that because I know in the past, people think certain areas aren't as diverse as they actually are. And I know that question has come up in the past. So I was just curious how in depth that was, the interaction with the jurisdictions. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands. So unless there is further discussion, we will adjourn the meeting of the Finance Committee, and I will turn the floor over to Chair Smedberg to begin our board meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Smedberg, Chair of the WMATA Board. Thank you for being with us here today at our board meeting of February 24th, 2022. Before we begin, I'd like to ask Ms. Ellison, the Board Corporate Secretary, to please call the roll. Ms. Ellison.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg,
Present.
Vice Chair Babers,
Present.
Mr. Zappi,
Present.
Ms. Klein,
Present.
Mr. Letourneau,
Present.
Dr. Lowe,
Present.
Mr. Drummer,
Present.
Ms. Martin Proctor.
Present.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Our first order of business is we have the approval of the agenda. If there are no objections, I'd like to consider the agenda approved as presented. Are there any objections? Hearing none, the agenda is approved as presented. Next, we have 4 sets of minutes for approval this morning. Board meetings from January 13th, 2022, January 27th, 2022, and executive sessions from January 27th, 2022, and February 10th, 2022. I'd like to consider these minutes approved as presented. Does anyone have any comments or objections to those 4 sets of minutes? Hearing none, the minutes are approved as presented. Next, we have our public comment and advisory body reports. First, we'll hear from our customers and stakeholders who submitted comments for the board. You can begin those now.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman. We have actually one public comment for today.
Okay.
Coming from John David of the District of Columbia. And unfortunately, why the blank are your people so derogatory language that you still cannot fix the trains? That concludes our public comments for today.
Thank you. Thank you to Mr. David. Next, we'll hear from our Accessibility Advisory Committee Chair, Mr. Posner. For a moment there, Phil, Ms. Rush was going to fill in for you at one point, I heard, right?
Yes, well, February is Cardiology Month, as Ms. Empasano said, and yesterday I had my cardiology meeting. And they said, yeah, you can go.
All right, very good. Nice to see you, Phil.
Oh, it's great to be seen. February is a short month with lots of holidays and lots of action, lots of congressional hearings, etc. The February meeting of the AAC coincided with the Virginia budget hearing for the fiscal year 23 capital and operational budgets. We spent most of the meeting exchanging ideas for talking points gathered from previous meetings and our constituents. Several of our members called into the hearing and gave statements. One member, Paul Semmelfruit, who's the chair of our Metro Access Committee, actually took off and went down the courthouse and saw you all in person. Members and constituents also spoke at the DC and Maryland hearings, and we wanted to thank Mr. Smedberg for chairing the Virginia and Maryland hearings, along with fellow board members, Lowe and Helfer, and thanks to Mr. Drummer for chairing the Maryland hearing. And we noticed Miss Ellison lurking in the back in Maryland, helping out also. The talking points discussed by the AAC included support of the board equity and fair policy principles, support for continuing the GM's programs for flat fares and increased service hours, extending the flat fares to Metro Access, as well as passes for Metro Access that would be equitable with those that are offered for bus and rail riders. We did have a fallback discussion. In case flat fares were not extended to Metro Access, we requested that the board please calculate those fares using a fair and sustainable multiplier instead of 2 times, perhaps 1.5 times. The senior disability fare on bus rail, since all Metro Access riders do have a disability. The bus rail subcommittee held the annual Hedinger Award ceremony, and board member Klein attended and stayed for the presentation to Barbara Millage, who led the lighting rebuild project, which has been incredibly successful for the low vision community, as well as for the normal vision community. There was also discussion of developmental disabilities and challenges in the juvenile population as well as the adult population faced by bus, rail, and Metro Access users who face these issues, and things that may be done to help them obviate these issues. The Metro Access Subcommittee spent time discussing and being updated by staff about the eligibility office move to L'Enfant Plaza, as well as updates on vans and sedan procurement for Metro Access. Further updates on the Metro Access fares, shared rides, abilities ride, flex, and the new Garmin navigation system. Denise Rush and I had a substantive chat with board member Drummer, and we thank him as well as the other board members who have attended our meetings and or chatted with members of the committee. I believe that these collaborations are valuable for reaching our shared goals of excellent, safe, equitable, and sustainable service. We hope that more board members and senior staff will have time to join us at meetings and ride-alongs to ensure that we remain focused on important issues to a modest success. And hopefully, as we kick off April and May, Mr. Smedberg and the GM might stop by and give us some marching orders. I was also reminded this morning at the executive committee meeting, in the old days before COVID, once a month, the executive committee used to meet in public with the leadership of the RAC as well as the leadership of the AAC. And we had wonderful little chats in public about all of these things. And I think I've used up a lot of time, so let me turn it over to the committee. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thanks, Phil. And it was actually Dr. Lowe who chaired the DC hearing. But I do appreciate, Phil, that your committee really did coordinate all your comments, and you were well represented at all 3 hearings.
Thank you.
All right. Next, we'll hear from the Riders Advisory Council, the Vice Chairman, Daryl Brewer. Mr. Brewer, welcome.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Good morning.
Nice to meet with you. I'll provide the Riders Advisory Council report for February. Under the area of membership recruitment, the RAC will be working with staff to recruit new members to fill our current vacancies and hope to have candidates for the board's consideration in March. We would also encourage board members to let their networks know about the opportunities to serve and direct interested candidates to the online application available on Metro's website. The board member RAC liaison. The board's RAC liaison, alternate director, always mess up her name, Ms. Helfer, attended our February meeting to formally introduce herself to the RAC and to discuss her role as a bridge between the RAC and the board. She is currently holding one-on-one sessions with current RAC members to learn more about their experience serving on the council and identify opportunities to improve the RAC's processes and effectiveness. We're looking forward to taking advantage of her significant experience with public outreach and stakeholder engagement to find ways to increase participation by both RAC members and members of the public. FY 2023 budget outreach. RAC members observed this month's public hearings on Metro's proposed FY 2023 operating and capital budgets and will be reviewing the input Metro received in order to provide the board with recommendations next month during the budget adoption process. General manager search. The RAC also appreciated the opportunity to provide input as the search begins for a new WMATA general manager. As the board identifies candidates, we feel that it is important that the candidates are under consideration are able to meaningfully collaborate with stakeholders to receive both feedback and advice. This includes not only the board's formal advisory groups, the RAC and the AAC, but also the business community, community-based organizations, elected officials, and members of the public, and will proactively communicate with riders about the state of Metro service and any upcoming changes, and can equitably balance the various competing needs of Metro's riders, recognizing that different riders' differing needs are not in conflict with one another, but rather interconnected elements that must all be considered as part of Metro's decision-making. The RAC recognizes the significant challenges facing the next general manager and looks forward to the opportunity to continue to be involved as the search process continues. Thank you. And on behalf of the RAC, we look forward to strengthening our relationship with you guys and look forward to a great year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer. Appreciate that. Appreciate your comments. Any questions for Mr. Brewer? Okay, hearing none. Thank you. Appreciate your time. All right, next, report by the chair. First, I want to thank all our customers and stakeholders who participated in the budget outreach public process over the past 2 months. We had 2,800 people take the budget survey. We also had 44 people take part in Metro's first ever hybrid public hearings, where people could attend in person, by phone, or by video. The hybrid hearings provided expanded options for members of the public to connect with board members and share their thoughts. The board looks forward to receiving the full budget public outreach staff report next month and discussing what we heard from our riders and other stakeholders as we make decisions about next year's budget. The goal is for the board to adopt the fiscal year 2023 budget at its March 24th meeting. I also want to thank our congressional delegation and partners for their continued support and desire to improve Metro. Earlier this month, the GM, the Inspector General, and I appeared before the House Oversight Committee for a hearing on revitalizing Metro. We thanked the members for the federal relief during the pandemic and highlighted the major strides we have made in areas of safety, equity, and sustainability. We also stressed that Metro service is going to be different after the pandemic, and the board, partnering with the region, will shape the system to meet the changing needs of our communities. Next, I'd like to thank our customers who provided input through our survey on Metro's next GM. As a reminder, we set up an email, WMATA GM search at kapartners.com, if anyone has any additional input or recommendations. And finally, I'd like to take a moment to recognize Metro's celebration of Black History Month and Transit Equity Day. Each year, Transit Equity Day is celebrated to collaborate on February 4th during Black History Month to honor the life and legacy of Rosa Parks. Metro has a longstanding commitment to diversity and transit equity and inclusion, and we will keep that commitment at the forefront of all we do. Over the past several years, the board has recommitted Metro to provide safe, equitable, reliable, and cost-effective public transportation, connecting communities, improving mobility, and stimulating economic development. Community access to transit equals opportunity, and Metro will continue to deliver on that promise. This concludes my report. Now I'll turn the floor over to the GM for his report, Mr. Wiedefeld.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the
Good
board.
morning.
I want to begin this morning with an important reminder for anyone that still owns a plastic Smart Trip card. Starting next Tuesday, March 1st, Smart Trip cards purchased before 2012, roughly a decade ago, will no longer work in the system, including at our rail station fare gates and fare vending machines and bus fare boxes. For customers who aren't currently riding Metro, you still will be able to replace your card and transfer the funds after March 1st, but you won't be able to use the cards to tap in. Originally announced in April of 2021, this planned phase out is part of Metro's fare modernization project, which includes the installation of faster, more reliable fare gates and bus fare boxes. For the past few months, we've undertaken an extensive communications campaign reminding customers about the upcoming deadline. This includes signage posted at all the rail stations and selected bus routes, paid social media ads and news releases, stakeholder outreach, and in-person customer outreach teams throughout the system. If anyone needs more information, please go to WMATA.com/card replacement. I also want to give you an update on the new office building. I'm pleased to share that employees will be moving in phases into Metro's new DC headquarters building beginning over the next few weeks. This is a significant milestone for Metro's office consolidation plan, which will reduce our office building footprint from 10 to 4 facilities. It will also bring an additional operating revenue, including retail space and office tenants in the new headquarters, as well as annual rent from the ground lease from the existing headquarters building at JGB. In addition to providing safe and modern experience, the new headquarters buildings at L'Enfant Plaza will also help advance recent revitalization efforts in Southwest waterfront area. Work continues at 2 other office buildings under construction in Maryland, Virginia, and we expect to open those within the next year. Finally, turning to service, over the past few months, bus and rail service levels have varied, whether due to Omicron or the Omicron surge, or the lack of available rail cars. However, we've been working hard to restore consistent service that our customers can rely on. The Metro Rail service recently improved on the red, blue, orange, and silver lines. Now trains operate every 10 minutes on the red line and every 20 minutes on all other lines. At stations served by more than one line, that means trains arrive often as every 7 to 10 minutes. And on Metro Bus, we've resumed regular weekday service now that Omicron surge has subsided and our employees have returned to work. I do understand how important every minute is to our customers, and I want to thank them for their patience as we've navigated through these challenges times. And also, I just want to end on an update on the 7Ks. The work is on schedule, and we have collected and analyzed sufficient data to identify probable root causes, and will now proceed with finalization of dynamic testing procedures, and to validate or reject the theories in terms of the issues with the 7Ks. I have been advised by TTCI, which is the firm that we're using, the independent firm, that it's very likely that a combination of issues contributed to the cause, and which tells me that the mitigations obviously will have to be varied as well. In this testing phase, we expect to learn what factors are ruled out, and we will continue to update the board, the WMSC, the NTSB, and other stakeholders when we can isolate those root causes and what that tells us about the timeline to return the rail cars. That concludes my remarks. I'll be glad to take any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld. Any questions for the general manager? If so, please use your raised hand. Dr. Lowe.
Good morning. I was under the impression that returning the 7000 series rail cars to service was not necessarily conditional on what was going on in the root cause investigation or in the NTSB investigation in the bigger picture, because these things, the timeline could be very long. I thought that we were looking into like a continuous monitoring technology that would be placed on the rails. Am I understanding the kind of the big picture here correctly?
They're potentially linked, to be frank. That may be a mitigation measure that would, give us the ability to get the rail cars back into the service. But until we get a better understanding of the root cause, we don't want to commit to that. It's again, but we're moving, assuming that's most likely one of the mitigation things that we'll put in place. It's a good practice to have regardless, but it also may help us with identifying, anticipating anything that be tied to the root cause to get the lines out there, get the trains out there.
Understood. And it's obviously it's like absolutely massive to make progress on finding the root cause. I'm like overjoyed. Do you have is there separately, is there any update on the procurement of the monitoring technologies? I know we talked about this at the last board meeting, so I'm not necessarily expecting any new news,
No, it's progressing. I mean, there's no issues
same
there.
Timeline as before.
Yep.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Proctor.
Hi, yes, good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time and for the report out. That was very helpful. Forgive me for not turning my camera on. It's acting a little wonky, so I just don't want to mess with our bandwidth. I do have a question with regards to the placement of the smart trip cards, and you might not have the answer to this, but does this include all the cards that were issued to the DC public school students?
Lynn, can you answer that to make sure I'm not, Lynn or Dennis?
Yes, Mr. Whitfield. No, it does not include those cards because those cards were of a more recent vintage.
They were post 2012, right?
That's
okay,
correct.
I'm sorry. Yeah, of course.
Okay, so they will continue to work at this time?
Yes.
That's not correct.
That is not correct.
Dennis, could you say that again?
I said that's correct. They'll continue
That is
to work.
correct.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was the entirety of my question. Appreciate the time.
All right, seeing no other questions. Thank you, Mr. Wiedefeld.
Thank you, sir.
With that. Okay, next we have 2 items on the board's consent agenda today, and I would like to move approval of the following. First, parking fee waiver during the 2022 platform improvement project. Staff is seeking approval to waive parking fees at Landover, Cheverly, and Deanwood stations, and for Metro riders at the New Carrollton and Minnesota Avenue stations during the 2022 platform shutdown. Non-rider parking fees will continue to be charged at New Carrollton and Minnesota Avenue stations. Next, 300 7th Street Southwest lease. Staff seeks authorization to execute a lease with the District of Columbia Housing Authority at Metro's new headquarters building at 300 7th Street Southwest. I would like to move approval of those 2 items. Can I get a second?
Second.
Seconded by Deputy Mayor Babers. The item has been moved and seconded. I'd like to call on the board corporate secretary to administer the vote. Ms. Ellison.
Thank you. Chair Smedberg,
Aye.
Vice Chair Babers,
Aye.
Mr. Zappi,
Aye.
Ms. Klein,
Aye.
Mr. Letourneau,
Aye.
Dr. Lowe,
Aye.
Mr. Drummer,
Aye.
Ms. Martin Proctor.
Aye.
Mr. Chair, the motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ellison. Now we'll move on to the reports from the jurisdictions. Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I personally don't have anything to report from NVTC. Mr. Letourneau, I don't think we have anything.
No, I don't believe so.
Yeah, okay, thank you. The District of Columbia, Ms. Babers.
Thank you, Chair. The only thing that I would like to report is hopefully everyone is aware that we are expecting in the DMV area some traffic disruptions beginning possibly today and lasting possibly several weeks. And so we are encouraging everyone who is coming into the district and moving about to utilize Metro Rail. And we're saying Metro Rail and not Metro Bus because the buses may also be impacted. So we just want to bring that to the attention of anyone who is listening. Tracy, do you have anything?
Thank you so much, Ms. Babers. The only thing I'd like to add is that WMATA provided some written testimony at a hearing of the DC Council's Transportation Committee yesterday on the proposed Metro for All bill. And that testimony, that written testimony, is part of the public record, and I'll be sharing it on social media in case anyone would like to read it.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lowe. WSTC, Mr. Drummer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have nothing to report. However, we would like to extend special thanks to Charlie Scott for his presentation in our WSTC public forum on February 2nd.
Great. Thank you so much. And the federal government, Ms. Clark.
Yes, we have no report this month. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So with no further business to come before the board, we will now stand adjourned, and I will move to executive session. In accordance with the bylaws, I, Paul Smedberg, request that the board of directors convene an executive session to discuss the following matters pursuant to Article 2, Paragraph 9, subsections A, budgetary matters that may affect the legal position, WMATA contracts, or sensitive relationships with local jurisdictions or the federal government. C, personnel or labor issues, including discussions of labor contracts, labor negotiations, or interview of candidates for employment, and the assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, or resignation of an individual. D, contractual or other matters, including confidential or proprietary concerns, or the investment of public funds where discussion in public would adversely affect the financial interest of WMATA. E, audit matters and investigations to include, for example, audits of IT security matters and investigations to be referred for further criminal investigation or prosecution. And G, disposition of WMATA property or acquisition of real property for the WMATA purpose where discussion in public would adversely affect WMATA's negotiation or bargaining position. Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Letourneau. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you in a couple weeks.